Chapter 4. The morning light crept through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the wooden floor. Mary sat at the kitchen table, pale and restless, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup without lifting it. Her eyes were distant, her movements slow, as if the night had drained something from her. Ellen moved quietly around the kitchen, setting bread to toast and stirring the pot of porridge. She watched her daughter from the corner of her eye, careful not to speak too soon. Mary hadn't slept. Ellen could see it in the way her shoulders sagged, in the tightness around her mouth. Something had shifted. The quiet presence of Jessie Henderson in the fields had stirred the dust of memory, and now it hung heavy in the air. Finally, Ellen sat down across from her, placing a bowl of porridge between them. "You didn't sleep," she said gently. Mary didn't answer right away. Her voice when it came was low and brittle. "Ma, it feels like the scab was torn off, like everything I've tried to bury came crawling back." Ellen nodded slowly. "I know." Mary looked up, her eyes rimmed with red. "Why did he have to come here? Why now?" "To help," Ellen said. "There's trouble in the area. You know that." Mary's jaw clenched. "He's already living on the land my children died on. Now he must be here too." Ellen reached across the table, placing her hand over Mary's. "He's not trying to hurt you, Mary. He's trying to protect what's still here. For us. He's not a bad person." Mary pulled her hand away. "He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't have ever been here." Ellen's voice softened. "You're hurting. I understand that. But Jessie didn't take the land from Jacob. The bank did. Jessie just bought what was left." Mary's eyes flashed. "He benefited from our ruin." Ellen sighed. "Maybe, but he's also been a good neighbor, quiet, respectful. He's never spoken ill of Jacob, never once." And then she added softer, "And he's always asked after you." Mary looked away, her voice trembling. "He lives where my babies laughed, where Jacob kissed me good morning, where everything fell apart." Ellen's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "I know, sweetheart, I know. But grief doesn't always tell the truth. It tells the story we need to survive, and sometimes that story needs to change." Mary didn't respond. She stared out the window, where the fields stretched wide and golden, and somewhere beyond them, Jessie Henderson had stood in the dark, guarding what remained of her life. Later that morning, Mary found herself drifting toward the once familiar footpath that led to Jacob's land, a path her feet seemed to remember, even when her mind wished they wouldn't. The fields stretched wide before her, golden and hushed beneath the growing warmth of the sun. The tall grass swayed in slow, deliberate waves, as though breathing with the land itself, and the cattle grazed lazily in the distance, their silhouettes dark against the shimmering light. She walked slowly, each step cautious, waited. Her shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, its frayed edges fluttering as the wind tugged at the fabric, slipping cold fingers beneath it. The breeze carried the scent of sun-warmed soil and distant wood smoke scents that once meant home, safety, morning chores with Jacob humming under his breath. Now they only reminded her of what had been lost. The path crested the rise and the land unfurled below her, the land she had once called home, where her children's laughter had echoed across the yard and Jacob's dreams had taken root with every seed he planted, but it was no longer hers. The fences, the fields, the house tucked just beyond the bend, all of it now belonged to Jessie Henderson. And standing there with the wind pulling at her shore, Mary felt the familiar ache tighten in her chest. This soil still carried her memories, but it answered to another man's name. She passed the old oak tree near the north fence, its branches gnarled and reaching. Beneath it, the soil was darker, richer. Jacob had always said it was the best spot for planting. He dreamed of expanding the fields there, of building something lasting. Now, it was just grass and silence. Mary stopped and looked out over the ridge. Somewhere beyond it, Jessie Henderson had stood the night before, watching over the cattle, guarding the land. She hadn't seen him, but she had felt him, like a shadow brushing against memory. Her chest tightened. She knelt in the grass, fingers brushing the earth. 'Twas warm from the sun, soft from the season's rain. She closed her eyes and let the wind speak. It carried the scent of hay, the distant lowing of cattle, and something else, something quieter, a presence, a reminder. She had spent 6 years building walls around her grief, shaping her life around absence. But last night, something had shifted. Jesse Henderson hadn't spoken to her, hadn't come near, and yet his presence had stirred everything she had buried. She hated him for it. She hated him for breathing, for waking up in the house she once called home, for roaming the soil where her babies once played. Mary opened her eyes and looked toward the horizon. The land was still beautiful, still alive, and though it no longer belonged to her, it still held her children's laughter, Jacob's dreams, her own broken heart. She stood slowly, brushing the grass from her skirt. The wind picked up, and for a moment she imagined she could hear Benji's voice calling from the coop, Emily's giggle chasing butterflies. She turned back toward her father's land, her steps slow, her thoughts heavier than before. The scab had been torn, yes, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to let it heal properly. Chapter 5. The second night came with a hush. The wind had settled, and the stars blinked quietly above the fields. Inside the farmhouse, the lanterns had been extinguished, and the soft creak of the old floorboards signaled that Ellen and Samuel had gone to bed. Mary waited. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the coat folded neatly at the foot, the one that had belonged to Jacob. It still smelled faintly of tobacco and soil, of the man who had once walked their fields with pride and purpose. She reached for it slowly, draping it over her shoulders. It was too large, but it wrapped her in memory. She lit a lantern and stepped out into the night. The air was cool, brushing against her cheeks as she walked across the yard, past the barn and toward the north field. Her boots crunched softly against the dry grass. The herd was quiet, clustered near the fence, their silhouettes barely visible in the moonlight. And then she saw him. Jesse stood near the edge of the field, rifle slung over his shoulder, his gaze scanning the horizon. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and when the lantern light reached her face, his eyes widened. "Mrs. Williamson," he said, stunned. Mary stopped a few paces away, her breath steady but her heart racing. "You didn't expect me?" "No," he said gently. "I did not." She looked at him, the lantern casting flickering shadows across his face. "I couldn't sleep, not with you out here, not with everything stirring again." Jesse nodded, his voice calm. "I understand." Mary's grip tightened on the lantern handle. Do you understand what it's like to lose everything in a single day? To wake up and find your world gone, your babies forever lost to you?" Jesse didn't flinch. "No, I've not lost any of my own babies, but I know grief. I know what it does, and I know how long it stays." Mary stepped closer. "You live on my land. You walk where my children played. You sleep in the house where Jacob died, where my babies—" Her throat closed up. Jesse's voice was quiet. "I know, and I've never taken that lightly." She searched his face for arrogance, for indifference, but found none, only weariness, and something that looked like sorrow. "I hated you," she whispered, "for years." Jesse nodded. "I know. But you didn't steal it," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. "You just bought what was left." Jesse looked down. "I didn't know what had happened until after, and I'm sorry." Mary's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. "You've been guarding my father's cattle." "Why?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Jesse said simply. "Because I owe this land something. Because I know what a desperate rustler is capable of." Mary was too caught up in the past to notice the rawness in his voice when he said the last part. She stood in silence, the lantern between them casting a soft circle of light. The cattle shifted in the distance, and the wind carried the scent of hay and dusk. "I don't forgive you," she said at last. Jesse nodded. I wouldn't expect you to. But I needed to see you, she added. To see if you were the monster I made you into. Jessie met her gaze. Steady, silent. Mary looked at him for a long moment. And you're not. She turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, the lantern swinging gently at her side. Jessie watched her go, the night quiet once more. The next morning, Mary woke later than her usual hour, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind still tangled in the night's events. The coat she had worn, Jacob's coat, lay folded on the chair by the window, its presence a quiet reminder of the steps she had taken, the words she had spoken. She hadn't expected to feel this way. She had gone to confront Jessie, to release the anger that had lived inside her for 6 long years. But instead of fury, she had found resignation. Instead of resistance, she had found understanding. And now, she felt unmoored. As she walked through the fields later that morning, the wind brushing her cheeks, she felt as though something inside her had shifted. Not healed, no, not yet, but loosened. The grief was still there, raw and aching, but the sharp edges had dulled just slightly. She thought of Jesse Henderson's face in the lantern light, the way he had looked at her, not with guilt, not with defensiveness, but with quiet sorrow. He hadn't tried to justify himself. He hadn't tried to erase the past. He had simply stood there, and somehow that had mattered. Later, Mary sat beneath the old oak tree, her fingers trailing through the grass. She remembered Jacob's laughter, Benji's muddy boots, Emily's soft curls. She remembered the sound of the screen door slamming, the smell of bread baking, the way the sun used to fall across the kitchen floor. She remembered everything. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel it all, not just the pain, but the love that had come before it. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if she could ever truly forgive Jessie, or herself, or the world that had taken so much. But she had spoken. She had stepped into the night and faced the man she had both hated and feared. And now, in the quiet morning light, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a silent release. Chapter 6. By the third night, Mary found herself just as restless as she had been on the first, perhaps more so. Sleep hovered at the edges of her mind but refused to settle, drifting away each time she closed her eyes. Something tugged at her, a quiet, insistent pull she could no longer ignore. There was something she needed to do, something she needed to face. The evening air was cool and utterly still, carrying the scent of damp grass and the faint sweetness of hay. The farmhouse had gone silent behind her, her parents long since retired to bed, their soft movements fading into the quiet. Mary waited until she was certain they wouldn't rise again, then pushed herself from her chair with a decision that trembled in her chest. She wrapped herself in Jacob's coat, the familiar weight grounding her, steadying her, and lit a lantern, shielding the flame with her hand as it flared to life. She stepped out into the night. The yard lay half-silvered under the moon, shadows stretching thin across the ground. Her boots whispered against the grass as she crossed the distance to the fence line, each step both hesitant and inevitable. She found him out there, Jesse, standing with his back to her, outlined by the soft glow of moonlight. Her father's cattle grazed nearby, quiet shapes shifting in the dark. Jesse's rifle hung from his shoulder, his posture alert yet unhurried, as if he had been listening to the night breathe. When he turned at the sound of her approach and saw her standing there, lantern light pooling around her, his eyes widened in quiet, unmistakable surprise. For a moment neither of them spoke. The lantern in Mary's hand flickered, casting shifting light across the grass and catching the dust that swirled lazily in the cool air. Jesse straightened, the quiet surprise in his face softening into something more cautious, almost careful, as though any sudden movement might send her back into the shadows. "Mary, Mrs. Williamson," he said, his voice low but steady. He clearly did not expect to see her again, at least not so soon. "I'd like to see the house," Mary interrupted, her voice steady, "the one that used to be mine." Jessie hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." They walked in silence across the ridge, the lantern swinging gently between them, its warm glow rising and falling like a heartbeat. Below them, the valley lay hushed beneath the sweep of moonlight, the fields stretching pale and silver as far as Mary could see. Each step forward tightened something inside her, as if the night itself were urging her toward a place her heart wasn't ready to face. As they crested the rise, the farmhouse came into view, faint at first, then unmistakable, its windows glowing softly against the darkness. Mary's breath caught, her lungs tightening as if the air had thickened. The porch was exactly as she remembered it, the familiar slant of the roofline, the narrow steps worn smooth by years of footsteps, the posts her children used to race around until they collapsed in laughter. Even the old treehouse Jacob had built still clung to the oak beside it, its crooked boards darkened with age but stubbornly holding on. Her heart clenched. The sight struck her like a blow, sharp, unexpected, and heavy with memory. For a moment she stood very still, the lantern light trembling in her grip. Everything looked so heartbreakingly unchanged, as though time itself had paused the day she left. Yet the truth pressed against her like a cold hand. It was no longer hers. The house, the porch, the tree house filled with echoes of her children's voices, all of it now belonged to another man, a man walking at her side. And the ache of that truth settled deep, a weight she felt in every breath. Jessie opened the gate and gestured toward the porch. "You're welcome to come in." Mary didn't move. "I didn't come to reclaim it. I came to understand." Jessie looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "I never told anyone why I came here." Mary turned to him, curious despite herself. Jessie's voice grew quieter. The words pulled from a place he rarely allowed anyone to see. "I lost my family," he said. "Cattle rustlers, back in Missouri. They came one night, armed, desperate." He paused, drawing in a breath that shuddered faintly, as though the memory itself scraped against old wounds. The lantern light caught the tension in his jaw before he forced himself to continue. "My parents and sisters were killed. I was working a field further out that evening. I should have been back before dusk, but my horse went lame. By the time I returned," his gaze drifted past her, into a distance only he could see. There was nothing left but smoke and silence. The house was still warm in places where the fire had touched it. I remember thinking, absurdly, that someone had left supper burning. Mary felt her breath catch, her fingers tightening around the lantern handle. She had expected regret, perhaps guilt, but not this, not a grief that mirrored her own in its devastating stillness. "I left everything behind," Jessie went on, his voice low and rough. "Couldn't stay another night on that land. I rode until Missouri was nothing but dust behind me. Came here to start over." He swallowed, the motions stark in the wavering light. "I didn't know what this land meant to Jacob. Didn't know what it had cost him to hold on to it. Didn't know it would cost me anything at all." He shook his head slightly, eyes tracing the shadowed outline of the porch, the yard, the fields stretching into darkness. "I only knew I needed a place where the ghosts didn't know my name, which is why I couldn't keep cattle ever again." Mary stood very still, the wind tugging at the hem of her coat. She had spent years believing Jesse Henderson was nothing but a taker, a man who stepped into the ruins of her life without a second thought. Yet hearing him now, she felt something inside her shift, slow and unwelcome. This wasn't the story she had told herself. This wasn't the villain she had carved in her mind. And yet, she wasn't sure what to do with the truth staring back at her. The lantern light flickered between them. Mary thought of the words she had flung at him. "You couldn't possibly understand." But he did. Grief had carved them both hollow. Loss had driven them both to silence, to isolation, to land that held too many memories. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jessie nodded. "So am I." They stood in the dark, two strangers bound by sorrow, the night quiet around them.